time, and I call the honourable member for Perth.
And I do apologise, Mr Deputy Speaker, to jump the gun, but I was just so appalled by the contribution of the minister. Let's look at what's actually happened here. A month ago, a court ruled, after an admission had been made by the minister that he had made a fundamental mistake in his I know it's a consent order. I know it's a consent order, member, but it was a court order based on consent that the minister had made an error, and not just a technical error, that he had failed to take into account in making a judgment on granting an approval, an environmental approval, under the EPBC Act, that there were various endangered species, and he had not taken those into account in coming to his decision. So it was an error made by the minister, an acknowledged error in his process, and his explanation was, I think, that he didn't have them with the advice that was given to him by the department, wasn't with the materials that he used to make the assessment. So we have a minister makes a mistake, a project is put on hold, the minister thrashes around like a snake with his back broken and decides, oh, it's the problem of the activists, it's a problem of the people that drew the court's attention to my error. I made the mistake, but it's the fault of those people that took this to the court and pointed this out. And indeed, so what we're going to do, we're going to have to change the legislation to prevent people like that whistleblowing on ministers that get it wrong. I mean, it's an extraordinary proposition. I mean, it really is very much like it's in the, I think it's very much in the same league as the proposal to amend Section 18C of the Racial Discrimination Act. Have their mate, Andrew Bolt, who goes out and publishes an article which names various Aboriginal people, accuses them of inappropriately and disingenuously claiming identification with their Aboriginal heritage without ever seeking comment from them. And on those very limited grounds, Andrew Bolt is found to have defamed these individuals. And so we can't have that. We've got to go and change the legislation, because this is not right. And of course, that legislation founded on strong community sentiment. People actually understood that what was being proposed was most unfair, and that it would be sending out a very dangerous signal to our multicultural, to our country, to the people of our country, that somehow or other speech that was disrespectful of people on the basis of their race was acceptable. So now we've got the same thing here. We've got a complete and utter overreaction to a ministerial error. And I mean, just look at the facts. During the period of the Labor government, during the entire time this legislation was in place, we saw approved $280 billion worth of projects in the resource area. $280 billion of projects in the resource area. And the Browse Basin in the Kimberley, sorry, can I just explain that to you? There was a final the company decided, Woodside decided, that it didn't want to proceed on that basis. Woodside decided it didn't want to proceed on this basis. It wanted to embrace the FLNG technology that had been successfully established, indeed by Shell on the Prelude project, and in fact, to a very large extent, the thing sort of was kept on life support to enhance the prospects of Premier Colin Barnett, who had, as per usual, nailed his mast to a sinking ship of the gas hub, and in order to help him out, that project was kept on life support till after the state election in 2013, and very shortly thereafter ditched. Nothing whatsoever done to do with the EPBC Act, just completely and utterly irrelevant to that process. It was a case of moving on, moving on. That's right. So now we've got, so as I said, $280 billion worth of projects, and my friend and colleague Gary Gray just reminded me that the scale of that, the scale of those projects, which included much of the investment in the gas fields of Australia, was larger than the entire Marshall Plan, which transformed Western Europe after the Second World War. So we've seen under this regime, far from us being unable to progress projects, when we have had competent ministers, when we have had ministers that didn't lose bits of paper, that didn't get all of their documentation together before they made a decision, we were able to live with this piece of legislation. We were able to live with the right, a limited right of third-party appeals. Now, it is only a limited right of third-party appeals, and it is quite clear, as my colleagues have, that have spoken before me have set out time and time again, only 0.4%, 0.4% of these referrals have ever, under this legislation, have ever been taken to court. It's a very, very restricted right to a judicial review. And I do think that it is quite appalling that we should say that this is inappropriate, that we want to peel back that jurisdiction. I mean, much is made by the fact that the New South Wales Environmental Defenders Office was involved in this, but as has been pointed out, it was in fact the Mackay Conservation Group that were indeed the applicants. But of course, you can't expect that a group like that would have the legal skills or indeed the financial resources to take on such a project. So of course they will go to a body, another NGO, that has the capacity to take this matter forward, just as I don't think anyone reflected negatively on the fact that the lawyers that were used by Adani in this matter did not come from the Galilee Basin themselves. You go where the expertise is. So, I mean, a fairly puerile point. We have got in society, and I just want to acknowledge that it's been sort of caused a little flutter for some unknown reason, the fact that during question time today I was reading this fabulous book, Capital in the 21st Century, which is a book that I've been delving into over the, not just over the last 6 months, Michelle, but indeed over the last year, because it really is showing us what is going on in society. That since basically there was a major reset of our economies and the distribution of wealth after the First World War. And between the First World War and probably the end of the 1970s, there was an increasing equalisation of the spread of wealth and income within the community. But from that time on, basically from the early 80s to now, that whole process has reversed. And we are now back to really the same record levels of inequality, of power and influence and capital that we saw during the Belle Epoque in the 1890s. So we do know that money, capital, and with that power and influence is concentrating more and more into the hands of fewer and fewer. And so the gap, not only in wealth, but the gap in influence and power is growing. And for us to be looking at this David and Goliath situation, with this poor little Mackay conservation group. A poor little Mackay conservation group up against, as you say, one of the biggest coal companies in India is somehow or other unfair, somehow or other has to be stopped. They have to be crushed. They have to be moved out of the way. And as I said, let us get back to the heart of what the problem was here, and the problem was the minister made a mistake. The minister did not have the documents before him. He did not take into account all of the things that he was required by law to do. He did not examine critical material that he should have taken into account in making his decision. And if it hadn't been for this courageous and vigilant group, that error of law would have never been brought to our attention. Now, this is very important. It is very important that we have environmental laws, and everyone has acknowledged that in this place. But these laws are worth nothing if there is no mechanisms by which they can be tested. And seeking to move out these groups, seeking to reduce and diminish the standing provisions or strengthen the standing provisions to make it harder and harder for these groups to ensure that proper legal process has been followed by the minister in making those approvals is incredibly unfortunate. I mean, this is truly a David and Goliath situation, and seeking in this completely inappropriate way to react, to defend, instead of being prepared to say, oh, I'm very sorry, the minister made a mistake, we've got to change this legislation because this is really embarrassing. The minister has made a mistake, that's embarrassing, so let's sort of like pretend that the problem is the law. Well, we know the problem is not the law. I go back to that fact. $280 billion worth of projects approved in one sector of the economy, the resource sector, under Labor's watch, and without any problem from this provision. We were able to work with this provision. I know, I've been a minister building things. I was Minister for Planning and Infrastructure. I was building railways and roads, and there was one little orchid that used to always pop up whenever I had a project. I always thought the Calendia hugeli was the sort of like bane of my life, Wherever I wanted to build something, there it was. There it would pop up every spring. It would sort of be found. And we had to work around that. We had to redesign projects. We had to make environmental offsets. I know it's frustrating, but you've got to do it. You work within the law. It's very important that we have these environmental protections, and it's very important that we ensure that those environmental groups are empowered to be the watchdogs to ensure that this legislation indeed is honoured. Not just in the spirit, but in the letter. I'm very confident that this piece of legislation will founder in the Senate. It certainly will founder in the forum of public opinion. And I think again it just goes back to show, and I say to the people of Canning, on next Saturday, you've got an opportunity to show Mr Abbott that you don't like the direction he is taking the country, to show the Liberal Party you don't like the person they've got in the Labor as their leader, the far-right agenda that has been prosecuted. Vote for Matt Keogh and ensure that we don't have ridiculous pieces of legislation like this coming before this parliament again.